the start of the hour. So we'll go ahead and get started while everyone's settling in. Let's just go over a few housekeeping items. If you are using a phone, be sure to turn off your computer speakers to avoid that feedback coming through. And be sure to mute your line unless you're speaking to the group. That will help us avoid unnecessary noises. And now that we have the logistics out of the way, I'd like to welcome you to week 3 of the Hawai'i Adaptation Planning and Practices online course. Shown here are the great group of folks who you will get to work with through lectures and discussions or as a point of contact. And we'll talk more about your first check-in with them later in this session. So today's agenda will include a shorter lecture than previous sessions. Maddie will cover the basics of step 3 and outline the assignment and homework for this week, which will be due this next Monday, so keep February 15th in mind. We'll also take a dive into a deeper discussion session this week using our breakout session feature, so more on that coming up. And just a refresher on the steps you'll have taken so far. After we completed step 1, where you defined your goals and objectives of your project area, we completed step 2, where you assessed specific local impacts of climate change for your area. So essentially in step 2, you're answering 2 main questions. How might the area be uniquely affected by climatic change and subsequent impacts, as well as how might regional impacts be different in the project area? Overall, you want to remember that this first part of step 2 is about scaling down regional impacts based on these broad scale projections that you'll have been exploring, down to site-specific impacts that are essentially based on your expertise. Y'all know the area best. So for instance, if you know that a regional climate impact will be an increase in non-native species, your site-specific consideration might include that invasive species will have a competitive edge over native ones, and that they have an ability to invade higher elevation habitats as climate warms. So these specifics will really help you design effective strategies in your planning process. And today you are going to be putting on your thinking caps. We'll do a little activity. In a moment, I'm going to bring up a virtual board that lists all the potential climate impacts that could occur in your project area, and you or your team are going to select your top 5 that might affect your project. And then in your breakout groups, you're going to discuss how these impacts will determine your project area's specific vulnerability to climate change. So we're going to be using the Annotate tool again. This is what we used that first week when we had the map up. What you'll do is you have a view options drop down, usually at the top of your screen, and you'll click on the Annotate box. That's going to give you a toolbar where you'll click on draw, and you can pick the specific symbol you want to use to cast your boat. So go ahead and pull that up for me and see if you can practice on this screen. Nice. All right. It's looking like y'all got the hang of it. I like that addition. Excellent. So squiggles add a nice touch. All right, so, is there a way to clear the screen, Courtney?
There is. If you can pull up your Annotate, and then there's a clear and clear all drawings.
Perfect. Sorry to delete your drawings, everyone. So here is the board that we're using that lists all the possible climate impacts. And so in your groups, or if you're working on your project individually, you can use 5 votes, and you can cast your votes however you like. For instance, you can put all 5 votes in sea level rise if you think that's your top climate impact for your project area, or you can spread it across 5 different impacts. So we're going to give you a few moments to cast your votes, and then we're going to talk about it a little bit more.
Elliot had a question in the chat. Oh, yep, Courtney just got it. So 5 individually, and then we can discuss as a group.
So it's looking like altered precipitation patterns / seasonality of precipitation is a big concern, as well as increasing drought conditions, wildfire risk, non-native plant species. Is there anyone who cast their vote in any of these topics would like to talk about why they voted for those specific impacts?
I have a question. This is Chris with Nature Conservancy. I'm actually on a phone, so I can't see the bottom two. I don't see any statement about the non-native, non-plant species like pigs and rats and such. And for me, I feel like what they do in the future will actually be a major player. And one example of that is, for instance, our Pichardia, our lolu palms. They have great germination rates. They do super well on their own, but their seeds just don't make it. And so we've talked a lot about what changing climate will do to rat populations, whether it'll increase or decrease. But I don't see anything that, I guess it would be under pests and pathogens. Is that the one?
Yeah, Chris, great point. That's definitely a concern to think about. And it's really interesting, your specific impact to your specific area as well. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, and that's a great point about splitting it out so that it's not just pathogens and then non-native plant species, but also having one that's non-natives that are not plants, like the feral pigs and rats. So we can definitely add any categories that might be missing to this list as well.
Yeah, because along that note, I would argue that actually Hawaii, in the absence of non-native species, both plants and otherwise, does really well with changing climates. I mean, the area to move between climate zone is so short that, like, our ohia, for example, have such a range of variability that it can handle, but it's that hitting that wall against the non-natives or being eaten before they can germinate that plays into this, at least in my view, as the one of the biggest reasons across all of our preserves. It's kind of the same story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Does anyone else share that sentiment with Chris, or found themselves looking for that impact on the list and wants to share?
I'll just add that I've heard from people like Elliot and Puava that they're also important interactions as stressors like drought and browsing animals that get their impacts get more severe under severe drought conditions. And so yeah, I've definitely heard people talk about Chris's concerns, especially in the context of interactions with other stressors.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Christian. Also noticed that there may be only 2 votes in the increase in lower elevation tree species. And that kind of, the low amount, and that kind of speaks to the importance of looking at your region and those region specifics. Would anyone who voted in that like to describe why they voted in that category? And that's okay too. We can always talk about this more in your group discussions. Is there anyone else who would like to talk about why they voted for what they did and what it might mean for their specific project?
I'm willing to share. This is Maggie from the Ko'olave team for our project. One of the ones that our 2 of our teammates on the call today chose in common is altered, without talking to each other beforehand, was altered precipitation patterns and seasonality, and then the storm surge events. For us on island, those 2 things are really crucial. Although Ko'olave has a dryland forest ecosystem, that's its traditional ecosystem, and has lived in the rain shadow of Haleakala its whole life. So it's not like it is expecting constant, beautiful, lush rainfall like Hana, but it does rely on some very traditional patterns of weather to provide it with the bit of vai that it does need to be thriving. And one of those is the No'ulu rain cloud that forms between the slopes of Haleakala and Koho'olave. And it's largely due to, you know, the water cycle and convection and generating that. But yet we're now seeing, with obviously the major degradation on Koho'olave, but also that is paired with the degradation up on Haleakala, you know, the removal of the sandalwood forests up there and the extreme deforestation that went on back in the 1800s and 1900s for that space has altered that relationship between the 2 islands. And so that cloud doesn't necessarily form as often as it used to. And when it does form, the moisture it does bring doesn't necessarily touch down onto the ground of Koho'olave due to that change in elevation and that forest layer as most of you guys probably know, the forests draw the water to the land. So without that connection, that pattern has definitely been altered in recent history. So that was one big one. And then the storm surges, obviously, we're already seeing that on island. We have increased large scale rain events, which cause more erosion and then cause more sedimentation in our nearshore reef ecosystems. So our project is kind of really looking at that relationship between the water and the rainfall and the precipitation patterns in our restoration areas, and seeing how that affects our ability to reforest moving into the future. Is that Hoku, do you want to add anything? Or Ku'ulu?
That's awesome, Maggie. Thank you for sharing those details. It's really fascinating. Yeah, is there anyone else who would like to add to that or share anything else that they would like based on their votes?
I could share, this is Elliot Parsons, Puawa. I could share a couple of my thoughts for Puawa, which would be, of course, increase in wildfire risk and increase in drought conditions that Christian also mentioned, altered rainfall patterns, more days with extreme heat. I think as temperatures increase, there could be, and we've seen in other ecosystems, thresholds where it seems to be the extreme that drives changes or even abrupt changes in ecosystem structure and function. So, we don't know if there could be some kind of tolerance of species where if we get a high enough temperature, then we have a mass tree casualty event, something like that. So that would be something that I would be worried about. And then some of these are either positively correlated or negatively correlated with each other at Puawa. So, with the increase in wildfire risk, I think that would lead to a decrease in lower elevation tree species, which is the one right above it, because we've lost a ton of native forest cover from wildfire. And so I think probably declining tree cover is one of our biggest issues, and that would be due to multiple things such as fire, drought, and non-native ungulates.
Thank you for sharing, Elliot. Really appreciate that.
I'm curious about, oh, sorry. I just had one curiosity about the increased, we had someone under increased water temperatures and also altered stream flow regimes. We just had one vote under each of those. And I was wondering if whoever voted for that would like to tell us a little bit more.
Sure, this is Nate from OISC. I can speak to a little bit about the altered stream flow, and our project focuses on Myconia calvescens. One of the biggest detrimental impacts of that species is its ability to aid in erosion, stormwater runoff, and flooding events because it has such a shallow root system and large leaves. So it really impacts the hydrology of areas, and yeah, that's why we put it there. And that's also, it does happen in the low elevation. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of computer issues, so I wasn't able to jump in earlier, but we put in increases in the lower elevation tree species with the thought being that that specifically relates to Myconia, which is prolific at the low elevation. So rather than thinking about it in terms of the native species, like some of the other projects do, we think about it in terms of an increase in our main target species population. So it's just my 2 cents.
Thanks, Nate. Well, we'll continue to keep these impacts in mind because we're going to break out into some breakout groups and discuss how these impacts might affect your project or might determine your project site's vulnerability and what that means for your plan development. So I'm going to hand it over to Courtney, who's going to give us some more instructions for that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Maud. So as she said, we are going to now split up into some breakout groups. And so we've got 6 different groups and you're kind of assigned into them based on your Hui or geographically. And so if you do feel like you're in the wrong group, let me know and I can try to move you around. But I think I got everyone assigned to the correct group. So what we're going to do is, as Maud was saying, start talking about the impacts you just rated as some of your top impacts and how you're seeing them play out locally in the projects and the areas where you work. And then we're going to start talking about vulnerability from last week as well. So what gives your system more adaptive capacity? How are those impacts and adaptive capacity interacting for your overall vulnerability rating for your projects? And then we're going to come back, and if 1 or 2 groups are willing to share, that would be great before we dive into talking more about climate change challenges and opportunities. And so we've got about 15 or 20 minutes in our breakout groups. I'm probably going to give us 20 minutes. So why don't we plan on coming back together at 9:45 Hawaii time. And so with that, I am going to send you all off into your breakout groups, and you each have a facilitator in there with you to help answer any questions and lead you through the discussion. And so let's see, I am opening the rooms, so you should all be able to join your breakout. And Heather, oh, there you go. Okay.
looks like we're first to it. So we beat everyone else. So if anyone wants to say anything, we're here. So if anyone else has anything else to add, go for it. Has anyone had any trouble or difficulty with the process? Are things making sense?
Makes sense overall. Sometimes it's hard to find your way through all these, like, I know I saw something, a list, you know, some question or something, and then I'm trying to find it in the work. Was it in the workbook or was it one of those other links? And so that's, I mean, the good thing about that is that there's so much information there that we can dig into, and so many guidance documents and all that, but it gets a little confusing sometimes about where I saw something.
Yeah, it's a lot of information. So I understand that. And also the navigation is not always the easiest within the workbook. That's one of the things we're working on. It's can be a little bit tricky sometimes. So
Yeah.
About that, but I'm glad that it's working and you're still finding everything you need. So that's great. What about Natalie? Is everything working out for you guys? It sounds like you're a little bit behind, but are you having any trouble?
Yeah, I felt the same way. Like it was a little hard to navigate, but I think I found, like, I got the, area where it had the homework and the listings. Nothing came, like for step 1, nothing came up for the automated management topics or forest types. Like nothing came up for us. And I don't know if it's because where we put our dot.
Weird. Yeah. Yeah, I can look at that for you and I can make sure that I can pull it up.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
I was like, maybe I just put our dot too high. I'm not sure.
Yeah, let me check on that for you and I'll make sure that there's not something weird happening. So sorry about that, but we'll figure it out.
Thank you.
Sure.
Lauren, is that something I can help weigh in on with Natalie?
Yeah, sure. So Natalie was saying that when she put her dot on the map, she didn't get the automated impacts. Is that right, Natalie? I think so. So she didn't get the automated impacts that came up for her area. Yes.
Okay, so the Hawaii specific impacts were missing. It didn't auto-populate.
It was like it was like the first step, the management topics and the forest types, like those ones.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those ones didn't come up. It was just blank.
Okay, so for management topics, that's for you to actually kind of like self specify.
Okay.
Yeah. So that is usually blank based on like sort of your subjective needs. But did you find when you went onto the impact section that those auto-populated? If not, I can definitely, either reach out to you afterward.
Sure, I'll let you know. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good.
We didn't get very far.
No worries. That's why we have a break week coming up next week. It's like catch up time. Andy, I'm curious, what has the weather been like on Oahu? I actually lived there for like 6 months out of last year, and I miss it.
You're asking me? I actually live in Hilo.
Oh, right.
But I was on Oahu last month, and also for a couple weeks in December, which is when Yumi and I last got together and why she commented on my haircut. We've been having some fairly strong winds on Oahu on our property at any rate, getting up to 50 miles an hour. And we've had some heavy rain events, perhaps not in this recent weeks, but the storm that's washed through has downed some trees and made some other interesting impacts. Nothing serious this time, but it just, you always have to pay attention to high winds in our location. It's fairly windy.
Yeah, definitely. It didn't damage any of your fencing, did it?
We had a large eucalyptus tree fall within our fenced exclosure at a kupu in a valley, and it went parallel to the fence, except for its very crown hit the fence, and for some reason did not bust the thing. We had it cut up, and we don't have to fix the fence at all. It
Wow, lucky.
couldn't
Just
have
barely.
fallen more perfectly. I don't understand it.
Well, that's good to hear. I'm glad that you didn't suffer any major damage. Well, I think that everyone is back now, right, Courtney?
Yep, I think so.
All right, awesome. So I'm going to share my screen, and then we're going to do one more final large group activity before launching into step 3 and then sending you off for break week. So let's get this set up.
And so as Maddie is pulling that up, I just wanted to thank everyone for the we had a really good discussion in our group. So I hope you all also had some really good discussions in your breakout groups. And Matt, there we go. So now what we want to do is, based on some of those conversations you were just having about some of the highest impacts that you rated earlier, and also starting to think about how much adaptive capacity does your system have, or maybe some of those management topics to bounce back from climate change or some of those larger disturbances, how would you rate the vulnerability of your project? And so you can either do this individually or as a group, but I would like you to use the Annotate feature again to please add a stamp on where within this graph you're rating the overall vulnerability for your project. And so I know that's a little bit complicated if there's multiple topics and multiple systems, but thinking about overall for your project area, based on the adaptive capacity of the system and based on those potential impacts, how would you rate the overall vulnerability? Awesome. I'm seeing most of the votes so far to be in that high vulnerability, a couple moderate. Would anyone be willing to share why you rated maybe as high vulnerability, or for that person and project to put it more as that moderate to low vulnerability, what you're thinking? And it would be great if we could have at least 1 or 2 groups share before we move on to step 3.
This is Yumi. So I'll share, I kind of stuck myself in between moderate and high, just because there's a huge impact if we experience even longer drought periods. It's definitely going to affect our restoration efforts and the survivorship of the plants that we restore in the area. And then it's also shrinking that band of dryland forest that we work in too. So that has some negative effects. And the ability for our project, our plants in that area to bounce back from these types of disturbances, it's going to need a lot of assistance from our crew in order to bounce back and make it through some of these drastic changes that we're experiencing. So that's my reason I chose kind of in the middle between moderate and high.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing, Yumi. That's great. Yeah, so really thinking about how are those disturbances to your system going to either be disruptive or supportive, and what does that mean for how you can be thinking about your management moving forward is a great place to be with your project. So thank you again for sharing. Anyone else interested in sharing what you're thinking about your vulnerability rating?
Oops.
I'll share. If no one else wants to jump in. For Koho'olawe, it's super resilient. It's been through a lot. It's had a lot of abuse and environmental degradation, and yet in the areas we've worked in since 2003, we have seen the forest come back. We have seen plants be able to take hold and thrive, and actually seed areas in between the rows that we've planted and send out their keiki. So I chose kind of like in a straight across from moderate on the adaptive capacity and just very disruptive, because most changes are going to disrupt an ecosystem, but Koho'olawe is just, the island itself is super resilient. So whatever we're able to, if we're able to help it, it'll bounce back. So it kind of lowers its vulnerability a little bit as a space.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing, Maggie. That's an awesome example of how the adaptive capacity and resilience of your system is really helping reduce that overall vulnerability, because whatever those disturbances are, you still have that resilience to be able to bounce back and move forward with adaptation actions as well. So that's a great example. Thank you for sharing. So hopefully this was beneficial for really starting to think about how to chunk things up for thinking about the adaptive capacity and the overall resilience of your system and those severe impacts and disturbances and what that means. And hopefully that'll help continue to inform some of the conversations about where those overall challenges and opportunities are for management now when it comes to climate change moving forward. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back to Maddie, and she is going to lead us through what to expect for this week and step 3.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Courtney. Would you mind clearing the annotations?
Yes, I can certainly try.
We could leave them there too. Okay. Thank you. All right, so yeah, this week we're introducing step 3, which is going to be all about evaluating your management objectives in the context of climate change. So this is really where we bring together those goals and objectives that you identified in step 1, and then the climate impacts that you identified in step 2 to think about how climate change will affect those goals and objectives. And then as part of step 3, you'll also be weighing basically the challenges and opportunities that climate change presents and scoring the feasibility of each of your management objectives under current management. So in some ways, step 3 feels sort of like step 2, and they are designed to pair well together, but they are distinctly different. So step 3 was really about how climate change is going to be affecting the site where you're working. So how vulnerable your site is to various climate impacts in terms of its ecology. And then in step 3, what we're doing is evaluating how climate change is going to affect the feasibility of meeting those goals and objectives, and essentially determining, are you able to do what you set out to do given the additional stresses that will be put on the system by climate change over time. So in step 3, we're asking the following questions. What management challenges or opportunities might occur? How will climate change make our objectives more or less difficult to achieve? And really, can we meet those goals and objectives, or do they need to be changed completely, or maybe just altered or modified slightly? So the first thing that you'll do in the adaptation workbook in step 3 is to identify those climate-related challenges to meeting your management objectives. So in this step, we list any of those vulnerabilities that are going to be making it more difficult to achieve a management objective. So for example, warmer temperatures and drier conditions might limit the regeneration of a desired tree species and make it more challenging to maintain that species into the future. And there's just a note here to focus on those challenges that are related to ecology and climate change, and to really save anything about the kind of like political or logistic context for later.
Actually, can I ask a question about that real quick?
Yeah, go for it.
Just for us, in terms of the political conversation around funding, it actually does affect our work directly in terms of being a tiny little island that needs money and competing with the rest of the state for DLNR money and other funding. So maybe it won't be a major focus, but it might come up as, because in terms of how the state decides to divvy up funding with climate change, other places that are going to need to mitigate their impacts are going to defend that they need that money more than we do. But anyway, I'm not saying it's going to be like a central, but it might end up in there because it kind of aligns
yeah
problem.
No, and I definitely don't want to minimize that. Really, this is just, that was kind of me explaining that, like, in the beginning of step 3, this is what we focus on, but then I'll kind of show you, we definitely want to make space for documenting those sort of complexities and considerations, and especially making space for those in our discussion section, but also within the narrative that you're writing in the adaptation workbook. So I'll kind of show you where that comes into play. Cool. So here are some, examples of challenges. Note that these are related to, climate change impacts. So for instance, if your objective is maintaining native species in vulnerable low-lying coastal areas, one of those main challenges you might have identified is that sea level rise and storm surges will result in losses of land in coastal areas. So what you're going to do in the adaptation workbook is go through and for each of your objectives, kind of write out either what that key challenge is or incorporate several challenges to that objective. And then once you've listed the challenges, you'll also want to consider any opportunities from climate change or that climate change may create for achieving your management objectives. So, we recognize that a lot of times this column is going to be potentially, more sparse than the challenges column, but we still want to make space to consider, any potential opportunities. So for example, the range of certain invasive species might contract in response to climate change, potentially reducing competition with native plants, or at least, making control measures more feasible for managers. So here we have some of the opportunities listed. So, for that objective, we were looking at maintaining native species in vulnerable low-lying coastal areas. One opportunity we might have is to create new habitat spaces further inland, or minimize fragmentation between existing and potential future habitat. So, oftentimes identifying these opportunities is going to start pointing you towards potential adaptation actions. So it's a nice opportunity to get down some of those initial threads of ideas for when we start working on step 4. And as we begin documenting challenges and opportunities, we can kind of start to see the big picture and, more clearly understand how climate change will affect our project. So we get a better understanding of, just how feasible our goals and objectives are, and also where we might kind of encounter some friction or see where things are stacked against us. And then next we'll kind of ask you, after doing the exercise of, articulating all of those key challenges and opportunities, we want you to give a feasibility score for your management objective based on that. So feasibility can be determined for individual or multiple timeframes. So it is useful to kind of like think about, how feasible something is now and how feasible it might be in the future. So you'll either give a high, moderate, or low score. So for high feasibility, that's where your opportunities are outweighing those challenges, or existing management options can be used effectively to overcome the challenges that do exist. And then a moderate score will be, if some challenges to meeting management objectives have been identified, but you think they can probably be overcome by using existing or planned management options. And then for a low feasibility rating, that's going to kind of be what you'll put down if you think that there's really not sufficient options for overcoming the challenges to meeting that objective, and that you might want to potentially reconsider it. So, this rating process is obviously super subjective and can be a little fuzzy, but that's sort of the point, because you know your site and your management resources the best. So we just ask that you go through in your workbook and you'll assign a feasibility rating to each of those objectives. And the point of step 3 really is to do a gut check and decide if your objectives are pointing you in the right direction. So now's the time to kind of slow down and see if you need to go back and make any adjustments to those objectives, or whether they're fine as they are. So if you are finding that you have a management objective with low feasibility, for instance, taking action to create refugia in high elevation forests, maybe that's something that you don't see as being very feasible. We do have, the chance to go back and access step 1 of the workbook and modify that objective. And one cool feature of the workbook is that it will automatically update all of your edits. So if you revise them in step 1, that's going to carry through for the rest of the workbook. And this isn't something that happens very often. So it is a chance to go back and reevaluate these objectives and change them, but most people kind of stick with what they have. It's more just, an opportunity for reflection and reevaluation if you feel like you need it. And then finally, here's the spot for other considerations. So again, we definitely want to make sure you have a chance to kind of reflect on what those social, financial, cultural, political considerations are in meeting your management objectives. So this is where you can kind of detail some of those narratives. It's basically sort of a free space for other items that you want to note. So for example, you might write something about needing more funding or staff time or volunteer support. So that's kind of the big idea with step 3. Again, the take-home message for this step is that you use this time to ensure you've created goals and objectives that are likely to succeed, or that you've at least, if acknowledged any low feasibility aspects of those objectives. And there is a difference between step 2 and step 3. So don't feel like you need to state all of those climate change impacts over again like you did in step 2. Instead, we just, kind of want you to briefly touch back on what those biggest management challenges or opportunities are. And yeah, are there any questions before we kind of, I'm going to run through an example from the adaptation workbook and just show you how some other folks did steps 1 through 3. But first I want to check in and see if anyone has any questions. Okay, so if there's anything that needs like further clarification or something comes up, you can drop that in the chat and somebody will get on that, or you can send us a separate email. But I'm just going to quickly run through an adaptation example before we wrap up. So this is based in Michigan, but I chose it because I think there are some interesting parallels that'll make it a relevant project to share with you folks. So it's kind of a nice time to go through one of these example projects before we go into our break week, so you can kind of just see where things are going and how these kind of adaptation workbook steps stack on top of each other. So this site is in Western Michigan. It's a mix of bog and prairie and forest habitat. And it's stewarded by the Land Conservancy of Western Michigan. And the main reason they acquired this area in the first place was because they wanted to protect the unique bog habitat. So their main goal really was to preserve a diverse mix of native species present on the site, and also to do some prairie restoration. So some of their more specific objectives related to this goal include maintaining a high floristic quality value, keeping the exotic species present at less than 1% cover, and then also to expand the prairie habitat slowly over time. So they're some pretty straightforward goals and objectives here. When it comes to step 2 and how those regional climate change impacts are going to specifically affect the site, these folks were particularly concerned about the change in precipitation patterns and specifically the dry summer conditions, negatively impacting the bog, which relies on high soil moisture. And there's also a lot of nearby farms, so they were also concerned about nutrient runoff from that with increasing heavy rain events. And then they were also starting off with pretty low prairie diversity. So they had a little bit of remnant habitat of prairie, but not much. And then lastly, they were worried about climate change exacerbating some of the problems they were already experiencing with invasive species. So then this is, the step that we're at as a group right now. So in step 3, these folks really brought back their considerations to their management objectives. So again, they were mostly concerned with maintaining the native plant diversity. So they were looking at potential climate-related challenges to that. And they knew dry summers and increased runoff could reduce bog plant diversity. And they were also concerned with a shrinking window for conducting prescribed burns, which are a pretty essential component of prairie restoration. And then lastly, they were concerned about the expansion of an invasive plant called spotted knapweed. But they did manage to also identify some opportunities presented by climate change. So they think that the native plant diversity could actually be bolstered by some more southern bog species expanding into the area. And then they also expected those hotter, drier summers to benefit a lot of the prairie species that are native to the area. So given all of those challenges and opportunities, they kind of went through and rated the feasibility of those things, of those objectives based on those, and decided on an overall feasibility score of medium. So in the end, they kind of decided that their goals and objectives were still feasible enough, and they didn't go back and change anything. And yeah, just kind of were sitting at that moderate feasibility level. So hopefully that kind of gives you, an idea of where you should be at by 2 weeks from now in terms of your projects. So now that you're kind of wrapping up step 2, we have this break week to sort of revisit and rehash those climate impacts from step 2 and then complete step 3. So this is, yeah, kind of the direction we're going. And then I'll pass it off to Courtney to wrap up.
Thanks, Maddie. So this week, just as a quick reminder, here's some tips for when you're working through the Adaptation Workbook online tool. So always remember, you can check your progress summary at that first tab, and you can see there's those tutorials that'll walk you through each step. So those video tutorials are a helpful resource for keeping track of what to be paying attention to within each step of the adaptation workbook. And don't forget, the way to navigate is using those little carrots or arrows. And then next slide, please, Maddie. And then just as another reminder, the course agenda is in there as well. I think this is a screenshot from the summer course, but you will see the course syllabus and the schedule for our course for January through March. So that's another reminder of where to check out the schedule. Next slide. Perfect. So this week in step 3, again, you want to be really focusing on the challenges and opportunities for your management objectives. And so really going back to that step 1 and making sure those are the clear objectives you want to focus on, or your priority management topics is going to be really important before you dive further into this step. And you can also use step 3 as you're really thinking about those challenges and opportunities to management that climate change presents as that gut check of, okay, does this objective still make sense? Is it feasible? And am I going to move forward with this because it is still a top priority? So those are some different things, as Maddie was mentioning, to focus on in this step. And then you can also click on adding a challenge. And so when you're in the adaptation workbook, you'll see there's those orange, yellowish boxes, and that's again where you can input your information. So you can add challenges, you can add opportunities under each of your goals and objectives. And then you'll be able to rate that feasibility as either low, medium, and high. And then next to that box, you can see there's a space for you to provide your reasoning and your rationale of why that feasibility is rated that way. And that's a great place where you can add some of those other considerations, such as funding opportunities, or the capacity with the number of personnel you have to help with management, or some of the other social considerations. So that's where you can put in some of those additional considerations as well. Next slide, please. Perfect. So for next week, over the next couple of weeks, because next week we have a break week since there's a federal holiday on Monday. So there is no class next week, but we would like you to please check in with your discussion facilitators. And so if you have questions, or you just want to do a gut check of where you're at in your adaptation project, please reach out to any of us from NIACS or the Southwest Climate Hub, and we can help walk you through some of those questions. And so between now and the next time we meet on February 23rd, please start thinking about finishing anything that's remaining from step 1 or step 2, and then start diving into evaluating those management challenges and opportunities for your objectives. And then our next discussion is where we're really going to start thinking about adaptation strategies. And so that's a really fun lecture. So if you can try to be up to speed in the adaptation workbook for really starting to dive into those actions, that'll be really helpful for when we meet on February 23rd. And so with that, I think, is that the last slide, Maddie? Perfect. Yep. So there's no class next week. Our next meeting is going to be on the 23rd. And so we'll have a discussion on some of those management challenges and opportunities in those breakout groups, just like we did today. And then we'll talk about adaptation actions. And so there are a couple opportunities between now and February 23rd. So again, check in with some of the facilitators and course instructors if you have questions. And then I also wanted to give Melissa an opportunity to talk about a feedback session that she is going to be hosting. So Melissa, if you're still on, I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you, Courtney. I'll try to make this quick. So I'm currently a master's student at UH Manoa, working to understand natural resource managers' experience of drought and drought information needs. And I thought I might be able to take advantage of the 1-week gap in the climate adaptation course to share the results so far and get feedback from folks, just to make sure I'm on the right track. To see if I'm missing anything in the major themes that have come up, the connections I'm finding, like, am I making stuff up, or is this like aligned with what you actually know and experience? And just to see if there are any other kinds of information or resources you might want around drought that has not yet come up strongly in the interviews. So it doesn't need to be a big group, but I'm hopeful that there will be at least a few that might be able to make it. And I'll try to send out an email to the larger group. So thanks for the space, Courtney.
No problem. Thank you, Melissa. And if you want, we can, if you send Maddie and I that information, we can include it in the post step 2 summary that we can send out to everyone, if that would be helpful. Awesome. Well, I think we've got a few more minutes left. So if anyone has questions, you're welcome to stay on and ask those questions. But otherwise, that's all we've got for talking about climate change challenges and opportunities and moving forward with steps 3. So we will see you all on maybe next week for that listening session. And otherwise, we'll see you on February 23rd. Mahalo, everyone.